This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Oral questions, questions orales, l'honorable chef de l'opposition.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Minister is not worth the crime, chaos, drugs, and disorder. It has now been 10 days and 60 dead British Columbians since the government of that province has asked the Prime Minister to reverse his deadly and radical legalization of crack, heroin, and other hard drugs in children's parks, hospitals, on transit. Why will he not reverse his radical agenda?
The Honourable Minister for Mental Addictions and Health.
Mr. Speaker, communities in BC are facing an extremely serious challenge. It is a toxic drug supply on the streets and people are dying. We know that public consumption is an issue of concern, which is exactly why, Mr. Speaker, BC is amending their proposal, and we have been working with them every step of the way. We're treating this with the urgency it deserves, and all partners are at the table right now, Mr. Speaker, to find the path forward, working with law enforcement and health services so that we get this right and save lives, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, to find a path forward, the path forward is obvious. Ban hard drugs, invest in treatment, bring our loved ones home drug-free. Now, that minister claimed last week that she was waiting for the BC government to provide information before she could decide on reversing radical legalization. It turns out the government had given her that information within hours of the request. She has all the information, so why are her and her radical boss clinging on to this insane policy?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister for Mental Health and Addictions.
Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we follow science, we follow healthcare experts, and we follow the information. We are working with BC on a comprehensive amendment to their proposal. This takes collaborative work, Mr. Speaker, to get it right. This is a health issue, Mr. Speaker, not a criminal one. The Leader of the Opposition is misleading Canadians in not recognizing that people need health care. They do not need to be re-stigmatized and criminalized.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Abbotsford Soccer Association wrote a letter entitled "A Cry for Change." Volunteers with the organization have found dirty needles that can puncture innocent children in the playing field. Other BC fields have had women raped and overdose, have found addicts naked, have had pets actually overdose because there's so much drug contamination on the site. What are they thinking over there?
The Honourable Minister of Finance and Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, a pilot project was put in place at BC's request. BC now has serious concerns about some aspects of that. We share those concerns and we are addressing them. But I do want to say, Mr. Speaker, I do not think there is a family in Canada that is untouched by the tragedy of opioids. And I think that it is absolutely abhorrent to try to score political points off the pain of Canadians.
Doesn't feel like Canada anymore. Life is more unaffordable than ever. Canadians, the Governor of the Bank of Canada, even random Liberals are saying this government is not helpful. They're out of control spending and not worth the cost. Canadians are living in their cars and in tents because they can't afford housing. They're lining up at food banks in record numbers because they can't afford food and leaving in droves because they can't afford the high cost of living. When will the Liberals implement a common sense plan and bring in a dollar for dollar law, cap government spending so inflation and interest rates can come down?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, we have put forward a budget that invests in the things Canadians need, first and foremost housing, And we're doing that by asking those at the very top to contribute a little bit more. And the good news, Mr. Speaker, is we are doing it in a fiscally responsible way. And you don't have to believe the partisans in any chair in this House. Talk to the analysts at Moody's, who last week reaffirmed Canada's AAA rating, the highest that exists, with a stable outlook. Doesn't get better than that, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Calgary Forest Lawn.
Speaker, common sense is chasing this finance minister. Just like in Alberta, she's speeding away from it. They've put taxpayers on the hook. $54 billion of taxpayer money is going to go to, just in interest to this Prime Minister's doubling of the debt. That means more money is going to bankers, bondholders, and this finance minister's Bay Street buddies than to doctors, nurses, and to the healthcare system. Why doesn't she pump on the brakes on the hypocrisy and let common sense catch up? Introduce a dollar for dollar law so inflation and interest rates can finally come down.
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, last week, Moody's reaffirmed our AAA credit rating. These are objective analysts who have pointed out that Canada has the most fiscally responsible plan in the G7. But let's talk for a minute, Mr. Speaker, about hypocrisy. Conservative hypocrisy. Last week, Mr. Speaker, the Conservative leader wrote an op-ed asking business leaders to attack our budget. I guess that's because he doesn't have the courage to come out and say the truth, which is he stands for those at the top, not regular Canadians.
The honourable member from Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Last week, the Governor of the Bank of Canada confirmed what millions of Canadians already know. Liberal spending is making life more expensive. 9 years of NDP Liberal deficits had led to a lost decade, lowering standards of living, record food bank usage, and a housing crisis. Will the government finally commit to a dollar-for-dollar rule that allow Canadians to feed their families and keep their homes?
Great job, Phil.
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I respect the member for Northumberland, and he is better than actually misrepresenting the words of the Governor of the Bank of Canada. The reality is the Governor of the Bank of Canada, in testimony since the budget, has said, and I quote, "The budget does respect the fiscal guardrails that the government put in place." And I quote, that's what he said. And he said, quote, "Keeping the debt to GDP ratio on a declining track, and importantly, keeping the deficit below 1% of GDP in future years. The budget commits to those guardrails, and that is helpful."
The honourable member from Northumberland, Peterborough South.
I will quote the Governor directly. He said that this Liberal budget is not helpful. It's more distraction, more denial, in order to cover up their record of massive deficits, which has led to over $54 billion of interest being paid in this budget alone. We'll pay more in the GST. We'll collect more in the GST, or collect more here than in the GST in terms of interest. We will pay more in interest than we will in healthcare transfers. When will they finally get their deficits under control so that Canadians can eat and they keep their homes?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, that is simply not true. I encourage people to read the testimony of the Governor of the Bank of Canada and news reports about that testimony. Here is what he said, and I am quoting precisely: "Keeping the debt to GDP ratio on a declining track, and importantly, keeping deficits below 1% of GDP in future years. The budget also commits to those guardrails going forward."